So this segment we're going to talk about the remaining tools up here in the toolbar. They're all kind of related, so it's not going to be easy for me to split these into different videos. So I will keep this basic, so this video doesn't drag on too long. So the first and most important tool is the direction arrows. Pretty simple. Click the arrow, drag, and you will move the block in the direction of the arrow. You can also click on the base here. You can see the base highlights, and that'll allow you to move the block freely around on that single plane. This is also leads into the snap steps. So we've got the snap step and the snap angle, and these can be set in the settings window. Here you can see I've currently got a 1 meter step and a 45 degree angle. So if I click on the tool here to engage the snap step, you can see I'm moving the block in 1 meter increments. If I go to the rotation tool, you can see I'm moving the block in 45 degree angles. Now you'll notice I didn't actually engage the angle snap. That's because the hotkey is just left control. So if you hold down left control and drag, you automatically engage the snap tool. So you don't actually need to go up and turn them on. You can just hold down your left control button on your keyboard, and that engages the snap. And you can obviously change these to whatever you want them to be, which is really handy when you're working to scales. So you can see I've set that one now to 3. I'll change that to 1. 15 degrees is the default for the rotation. Rotation again, obviously easy, covered it with a snap. Just grab one of these lines and rotate them. Turn the snap on with left control, and you can snap them in your different degrees and whatever settings you've got set up here. Scale tool, as you would imagine, it does scale the block, and it scales it in the same direction based on the pivot point. So you can see here it's scaling both ways. If I pull this one up, it's only scaling one way. That's because I currently have my pivot point at the base of this block, and on this block that's where the pivot point is. If I change this to center, you can see now I'm scaling it both directions. We'll talk more about pivot points in a minute, but it is important to understand how pivot points work, especially with advanced building and building with groups. So this scale here is basically a scale for the face. You can essentially stretch each face in whichever direction you want, and that's really handy if you're building walls, because you can build a wall, you can copy the wall, and then you can scale it out this way, scale it this way, and you've got a perfect join here in the corner. The hand tool is really handy, pardon the pun. What it does is it takes a directional arrow and sets it so the block can be freely moved around. But what it also does is it will align the pivot point on this block, which is the bottom, against another block. So if I move it against here, you can see I've now moved it. It's moving up flush with that face on that block. I'll stick it on the top. It's now flush with the top. So that's really handy when you are bringing new objects into the game. So for example, let's bring in a sofa, and when you bring them in, they normally appear in the middle of nowhere. So you just have the hand tool, click inside the square, and it positions it against the flat against the floor, if you like. Now you don't actually need to select this or use the hand tool. You can just have your directional arrows. So there's my directional arrows, and you can just press the space bar, which changes it and turns on the hand tool, and you can now move it around as well. So just pressing spacebar will bring up the hand tool, and you can very quickly move props around, bring new props into the game, put them on the floor, and they'll be perfectly aligned on the floor. So that's a really handy tool to know how to use. Makes it quick to align stuff to a flat surface like a floor. Alright, let's move on to the transform tool here, which I've already got open. You should always have this open, get used to using it. It's a really handy tool for knowing exactly where the location of each block is in the world. So with this block here, I can see that here's its exact location, here's its rotation, and here's its exact size. and I can change single blocks using this tool. So if I want to change the size of this to 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter, this prop is now exactly a 1 meter square. If I want to change that to 10, I can now change the size of the prop and have a prop that's exactly 10 meters wide. So I'll just change this back to 1, and you can also change the location of the prop, or the block, sorry. So let me just change this to 0, 0, and 0, and you can now see I have this block right dead center in the middle of the world. So that's handy when you're building the scale, because you can now move this 5 meters. It's now moved 5 meters to the right, or you can make this -5, and that's now moved it 5 meters to the left, all based off this 0, 0 position right in the middle of the world. Just change that back to 0. So the transform tool is very, very handy if you are aligning two props together. So let me just lift this one up, and I'll just make him a bit flatter, and I'm going to copy him and move him off here to the side, and I'll just make him a different color using the color tool. So if I want to try and align these two props and make a perfect floor, it can be quite tedious to try and do it. So what you can do is you can copy the y-axis of this one and paste it into the y-axis of this one, and you basically have a perfectly aligned prop. So you've got a smooth floor surface. That's one of the handy things you can use with the transform tool. Use the transform tool for. Okay, now let's talk about local and global. So what this means, it relates to the position and how a prop moves within the world. So you can see this prop here is nice and square and straight. If I change this to local, really makes no difference at all as far as how I can move this prop. But if I rotate this prop to the left slightly, and now I change this, oops, let me just go back to my arrows. You can see my arrows here are nice and straight. If I change this to local, I can now move this prop based on its local position within the world. Alright, so that's important when you're building with angles and you want to align props side by side, or you're building something that requires you to move the prop at a certain angle. You just set it to local and it'll move at the angle that you've got it on. And you can set it back to global again, and it'll move it based on its global position in the world. So for example, if you want to make a T, let's just copy this and we'll change this to center, and we'll spin this around. Now if I have this on global and I try and move this up and align it on the top, you see it's not going to work because it's moving straight up and down as per the global location. If I set this to local, you can now see I can stick it on the top, and I can make a T shape for whatever reason you need a T shape made. So that's what local and global does. Now let's move on to this one, which is center and pivot. So what this one does, I'll just bring this prop back to square again. You can see that the directional arrows are in the middle of this block. If I set it to pivot, it takes me down to the pivot point of the block. Now that's important because when you're moving props around and how they, especially when you're moving groups of props and rotating groups of props, if your pivot points are all in different locations, it will make all the blocks react differently. So I'll probably make another video and go into a lot more detail of just how important it is to understand the pivot points of the blocks, because they are all different, and how spending a bit of time and understanding them makes building easier and simpler, and I guess some more advanced techniques that are out there. So it's also important when working with groups of blocks. So let me just bring in, I'm going to merge the sofa that we had. So here's our sofa. If I click on this group, and based on pivot, and if I go rotate, you can see I've just destroyed the object because I'm rotating all of the individual objects blocks on their pivot point. If I set this to center, I'm now rotating it on the center, and it's fine to move around. Same if I do this with the local and global. So I'm currently on the global setting. So I'm going to move it in a global location, global direction, which moves it with the world. If I set this to local, you can now see I'm moving this in relationship to the rotation of the actual prop itself. Okay, the next one up here is the focus tool. So essentially if I click on this prop here, and I click the button, I focus on it. So basically all it does is bring the block into your field of view. If I select the floor here, because it's a much bigger block, and click the focus button, you can see it zooms me out so I can see the whole block itself. If we click on an object, a group of objects like that, you can see it zooms in on the group of objects. Now you can also use F for this as well. F does the same thing. F is a hotkey for it. So the color tool, color brush, that's pretty self-explanatory. Click on the prop, slide it around, change the colors, and you can make multiple colors. Pretty simple. So the group tool, here we got grouping and ungrouping. So if I select these three props, and I'm just doing this by holding down the left control button and selecting the other ones, and then go group, I now have a group of props, and I can move them around as a group, or I can ungroup them by clicking the other button, and they're now individuals again. One tip with this as well is if I group these up, and I just want to move this single object within the group, I just have to double click on it, and it deselects the other two, and lets me move it around without actually taking it out of the group. So now I can go back onto the group. I want to move this one, go back to the group, and so double clicking on a prop on a single block within a group allows you to actually move it by itself. So we go here, I double click on this section, you can see I can now move this one by itself. And that's that's the basics of the tools up top here. Again, you can do a lot more with them, and I might make some more videos on how to do that down the track.